Hey there, quilting friends. It's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and today we're working on t-shirt quilts. This is going to be a three-part series. The first video we are going to do today, and that's where we're going to talk about the materials and supplies that you need, go over any concerns, trepidations you might have in doing a t-shirt quilt, and we're going to get all of our blocks to this point where they are squares and ready to go. In video number 2, we're going to talk about the t-shirts that just don't want to behave. The ones that don't want to square nice, that don't want to go easy, and what kinds of things you can do to overcome some of the things you might come across when trying to put together a t-shirt quilt. And in video 3, we are going to talk about how to put this whole thing together. So you ready? Let's get started. Okay, so the first question is, where do you get your shirts from? What kind of shirts can you use? And you can use all kinds of shirts. A t-shirt quilt is really pretty simple to make. You get your t-shirts, and these ones all have this an iron-on. So these shirts were all given to me by teachers at my kiddo's school. This was their dean, who retired last year, and on one of the last days of school they all wore these shirts around campus, and then they didn't really have any use for them anymore. I mean, what are they going to do with a shirt of a retired dean? Like emoji, his Bitmoji on the shirt, right? What are they going to do with that? They didn't have use for it, so they gave them all to the librarian, who gave them all to me. And I've been meaning to make a t-shirt quilt with these forever. So you can get them from anywhere. You can collect them over time. So you can get baby clothes over time. High school kids often will have shirts that from different sports that they've been in, different events they've gone to. Folks will have shirts for different conferences. People who go and do the same event year after year after year will have the shirts from over the years. So all different kinds of ways that you can get the shirts. These ones, I'm excited to share about these because these have an iron-on already on one side. So that's going to mean that we treat these a little bit differently, actually just basically a little more carefully when we go to put our interfacing on the back. Okay, so the next question, and it's this crazy fear that people have, which is, well, I'm used to dealing with woven fabric, and woven fabric doesn't stretch on me. But as we know, anyone who's put a t-shirt over their head, a t-shirt will absolutely stretch on you. And if you have fabrics that stretch as you're putting them underneath your sewing machine, especially if the feed dogs grab on the bottom and you've got nothing grabbing on the top, so you've got a flat presser foot on the top and feed dogs grabbing on the bottom, you can get ripples. And also your fabric can stretch while it's getting pulled underneath there. And so quilters, we get worried about stretch, but we don't have to worry because we have a magic thing to counterbalance, and that is interfacing. When we get to this step, we'll talk about this. So interfacing will keep your shirt from stretching. And then the last big concern is, what if I mess up? Like, these are somebody's shirts, and there's only one of each one of these shirts. These are 100% unique. If I ruin one, like, what, right? Okay, so two things. First of all, I've had these shirts for a year. If I ruin one and it doesn't make it in the quilt, probably no one will notice. So maybe a tip there is to just, wait a while till you make it and no one will remember what shirts they gave you. Probably not the best tip there. But the other is, there are so many ways that you can fix this if it goes sideways on you. So we are going to end up trimming these square. And when we trim these square, what happens if my ruler slips and I cut off a little extra? Not a big deal. What I'll do is I'll trim this a little closer, and I'll just add what's called a coping strip. So just a little bit of extra fabric, and then retrim it square, and now I've got a little accent in my quilt. So mistakes are really just opportunities to add some interest and movement to your quilt. It will be fine. You should not be afraid of cutting up these quilts. All right, so now that we've gone over the basics, let's get into the nitty gritty and actually start working on this t-shirt quilt, and I'll be answering more questions as we go. All right, so I'm gonna grab a pair of scissors here. These are actually from my friend's Krista's grandmother. She gifted me these. Okay, so generally the way that I prep a shirt is I'll start by cutting up the sides. This might need to be sharpened, that's okay. I can grab some of the scissors in a minute if I need. Because I'll tell you a secret, I've actually already prepped most of these shirts in terms of cutting them. My mother-in-law was in town and she asked, hey, is there anything that I could do that would be helpful to you? And I said, if you could prep these shirts for me so they take less room in my office, that would be amazing. So she did, and we cut off she cut off all the backs for me so that I just had a couple of these left to be able to show you how this works. And then we're good to go. Okay. So just for reference, I'm cutting up the sides of the shirt and in front of the sleeves because I already know what size I am going to cut or going to square up these blocks to. These ones are going to be at 8.5 if I remember right. I grabbed my ruler out, so we'll talk about that in a second. But I already know what size I'm going to make my blocks because I have like 34 shirts, and if I did these really big, it would make for a huge quilt, and we don't need like a huge king size quilt for this. So I know that everything I need is going to fit inside here. If your shirts have much bigger motifs that extend out to the sleeves, it's okay to have that sleeve seam in your quilt. It'll be totally fine. But what you'll want to do is you'll want to cut across the top shoulder. So shoulder down and then into the armpit and down. And then same on the other side. Up into the armpit and across, and then across that top shoulder, right? If you are uncertain about this, don't prep all your shirts ahead of time. Prep one, make a block, figure out how that works, and then prep another. And once you've done like 4 or 5, you'll get in a groove, and then you'll be able to prep and do it more assembly line fashion. Okay, so this this one is a baseball style shirt, and so you can see she actually cut the back out and left the sleeves in just in case I need to get in here. And then I also have this extra sleeve fabric that I can use as a coping strip in case I make a mistake. Okay, so that's prepping your shirts. Fairly simple. We're now going to go to putting on the interfacing on the back. Okay, so y'all like knowing exactly the products that I use. I'm not sponsored by any kind of interfacing company, so this is what I grabbed. This is Pellon Fusible Sheer Weight White. So I don't need thick and bulky. In fact, I don't want thick and bulky because a thick interfacing is going to make my quilt crunchy. So I want a really thin fusible. And it's important that it's fusible. It's important that it's thin. The rest is up to you. Like, you don't want a black interfacing on the back of white t-shirts because that'll like bleed through. But other than that, it can be whatever brand you want. You can get it wherever you want. There's all kinds of options for getting just a thin, fusible, and this is a sheer weight, so very lightweight interfacing. The point of the interfacing is that all of these glue dots, you can hear that texture, all these glue dots are going to secure to my shirt and make it so that it doesn't stretch anymore. And that's going to make it so much easier to sew together. So what I have already done is I've prepped these. My ruler is 9.5 inches. That's what size I'm going to square everything up to. So I cut them a little bit bigger than 9.5 inches. The bolt itself is 20 inches wide. So I cut 12-inch strips and then I cut them in half. So these should all be roughly 10 by 12. And that's also really convenient for this because all of these iron-ons were printed out on 8.5 by 11. So knowing that my pieces are 10 by 12 means I know that my interfacing will be bigger than this design. Now, interesting about this design is that if you look where this design is, there isn't any stretch because of the iron-on here. But I'm not stitching where the design is, I'm stitching around the edges. So I'm going to lay this on my ironing surface. I'm going to take my interfacing piece. I'm going to lay it down, and you actually want to start this on a little lower setting. I usually have my iron on full blast. So we're going to talk about the 3 things that are important when you're putting on interfacing. One is the heat. The heat is what melts these little glue dots. That's why it's called fusible. There's little dots of glue. Think of them as like little plastic beads, right? If you were to put plastic beads in the oven, they would melt little bits of plastic, right? They're going to melt with heat. And what happens when they melt is they become liquid. And then if you wait a minute, they cool and they become solid again. And when they get solid, they're going to get it, because that liquid got in between the fibers of your fabric. That's what kind of glues it to the fabric. As they get liquid, that liquid seeps between the fibers, they get solid. Now it's locked in with the fibers, right? And that's going to keep the fibers from shifting, because now the fibers have been glued into spots. They don't have as much room to groove. That's the whole point of this interfacing, is to keep those in place. Okay, so heat is the first thing. Time is the second thing, how long you keep that heat on the surface. And then the third is pressure, so pressing that down so that those glue dots, when they melt, get into the fibers, right? Heat, pressure, and time are the 3 factors that will get this to fuse to our shirt. So I'm going to start in a little corner here. That's looking good. And I want to move as quickly as I can on this one, because I already have a fusible design on the front, and I don't want to remelt that if I can help it. Also, I want to be careful that I'm lifting up my iron between. And the reason I'm lifting it up is because I don't want to be pulling it across the fabric, because that might stretch the fabric. And if I stretch it and then fuse everything down, then I have fused it in a stretch spot. I want to fuse it as natural as possible. Okay. Alrighty. I had a thread on my mat and that fused to there a little bit, but that's okay. So that looks, it looks fantastic. It looks perfect. That's exactly what I want. And I've got that interfacing on the back and the design on the front. And if you look, it stretches here. But if I go over to where the interfacing is, I don't get the stretch there. All right, so you can do this over and over again on all your shirts, and I will in just a little. So I'm gonna move my ironing, my pressing mat out of the way, move my iron out of the way for a little bit. I'm gonna keep her on, and we're gonna square up. I have a whole video on squaring up. You've probably already seen it, but in case you haven't, you can either, hopefully there's a link up here that you can click if you want to go see that, or the link will be down in the video description below, because I don't think on mobile you can do those quick and easy clicks. Now I've got this about an inch away from here, an inch would be there, an inch would be there, and okay, so I'm just doing my best to center this, and no one's going to know what your intent was when putting this quilt together. Like, I could if I wanted, and I probably would have had to fuse my fusible on. I fused my fusible on the back thinking of it as centered, but I could have fused my fusible on different and said, okay, I want this intentionally uncentered. I know I'm going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, but now I want it like this. That way I don't have to worry about centering my images, and if I do this with all the blocks, like bounce them around in different spots, some are more centered, some are more left, some are more right, some are more top, some are more bottom. it can make for a really dynamic quilt. You get to decide. If centering things, fussy cutting things is your nemesis, do this. No one will know. They'll think, oh my gosh, you're so creative. I'm just avoiding the things that make me crazy. But don't tell them that. They'll say, oh my gosh, you're so creative. And here's what you say. You say, thank you, because you are. All right, so we're gonna go ahead, fingers crossed, but it's gonna be fine. And we're gonna go ahead and cut this. Okay, moment of truth when I flip this over. How did I do? And if you look, we'll zoom in right here, I missed. I didn't perfectly center my piece of interfacing on the back. I was trying to get away with using smaller pieces, and so I missed, and all of this right here isn't interfaced. And that's like not ideal, because this is the seam and that's exactly the part that I want not stretchy, and it's the part that's uninterfaced. So super simple when I'm done, actually. Because I don't have any scrap because I cut these all like perfectly to size. I'm just gonna take, steal a little bit, grab my pressing mat. Now, if I were to put this right on my pressing mat like this, I would be fusing it to my pressing mat. I don't want to do that. I have scrap fabric sitting right here. I'm gonna take this scrap fabric. This is gonna be like no contrast at all for you to be able to see on the video, so I'm gonna talk this through really well. Okay, here's my edge that needs interfacing. Make that nice and smooth. Here's my interfacing. Feel it, bumpy side down. If I overlap this a tiny bit, it's a really light interfacing, it'll be fine. Now if I'm careful, yep, I lifted it up while before those beads of glue had a chance to cool. And now I can just grab my scissors. Or I could retrim this up with a rotary cutter, but the scissors are right here. All right, rotary cutter would have been a better idea, but that's okay. It's okay if I have a little bit of extra interfacing because I'm going to be using the edge of the block as a seam allowance. Okay, we'll move you out of the way. And now I just added a little bit of extra interfacing. They overlap each other just the tiniest bit. It feels not super securely fused. Just gonna give it another hit with the iron. Just make sure that's really on there. And that's it. Once you have these squared up to the size that you need, adding any coping strips is needed, totally fine. You're gonna be able to sew these together just like regular quilt squares. Because now, look at this, they're not stretching. They stretch just as much as regular cotton fabric does. So once you have a bunch of these, you can now put them together just like regular quilt squares, which means that you can add sashing. If there are fun fabrics that you want to use for the edges, let's say that they love flip-flops, and you can find a cute flip-flop fabric, or florals, or whatever their favorite is that you want to add in the sashing, you can add sashing. This quilt is going to be big enough that I'm just sewing the squares together. I'm not even sashing it. Super easy. So I will just stitch them all together just like a regular quilt top. And then once you have the quilt top done, you can add borders if you want. You can quilt it just like a regular quilt. It's that simple. All right, that's it. We got all of our blocks put together. That's the end of part 1. I do have some t-shirts that didn't want to behave, and so I will be bringing those over into video number 2, where we're going to talk about t-shirts that don't want to behave, that don't want to cooperate. And then we're going to go to video 3, where we're going to lay the sucker out, figure out how we want it to look, and actually sew it all together on the Baby Lock Jubilant. So that's it for today, my friends. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. And make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I could not do this without the subscribers that I have, and I want you to join in this community. So make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you're notified whenever I have a new awesome video for you. That's it for today, my friends. I will see you right here real soon. Bye for now.